I would say at least that's an open question. Now, it isn't obvious to me in some sense that we'd want to. You know, I asked my parents once, a while back, I said, if you could take a pill that would restore you to your health at age 18, knowing everything you know, you could keep everything you know, would you do it? And the answer wasn't immediately yes.
Yeah.
And it made me think about Socrates' death and his apologia. Socrates makes the case, more or less, I believe, that if you lived your life fully, that would be sufficient.
Yeah. And then death
Right.
becomes your glory, you could say. And that, I think, is the ultimate kind of Christian surprise, right? Is that there's a relationship between dying and glory. If you're willing to die willfully, then, you know, your last death, that death at the end, will be almost irrelevant. It'll become like the moment where you shine. And we have little examples of that, right? I mean, we have little examples in the sense that great men, when they die, then they shine, right? We saw it with Queen Elizabeth, for example.
Right.
She dies, and because she had spent an entire life where people
In
loved
sacrifice.
her. Exactly. And then all of a sudden, it's like you can see her glory in her death. And in some ways, maybe that's, yeah, maybe that's what death can become for people who really are willing to die willfully.
And to live completely.
Yeah. And you see, I mean, of course, in the story of the saints, that's what you see. And that even the relics that we saw today are examples of that, where you're looking at the bones of people, like the bones of saints. And it's almost, people would think it's so morbid. Like, why do we have this? But this is, I think that's what's going on. It's like these men, these women were so loved that their corpse becomes glory. And that it becomes a seed for imitation, a seed for transformation.
We saw people too today carrying crosses on the Via Dolorosa. And again, to speak psychologically, I mean, the alternatives are that you pick up your cross and carry it, or that you don't. Those are the alternatives. So then we might look at, well, what are the consequences of those two pathways?
Yeah.
You said your brother is writing something like that now. It's like, well, we could either live biblically, or we could live non-biblically.
Yeah.
What are the alternatives? Okay, well, let's look at the cross motif. It's, well, the cross is the center point, and it's the point of maximal sacrifice, and it's the point of maximal pain, and it's the point of maximal acceptance, and it's the heaviest possible burden. And so you might say, well, to pick up your cross and stumble uphill towards the city of God is literally to pick up the burden of life. And more than life, I thought, because Christ heralds hell, it's not just the burden of life, it's the burden of atrocious malevolence that's associated with life. It's both. It's not just death and mortality. That's not heavy enough. Heavy as that is, there are worse things.
Yeah.
You know,
But it's interesting, because then Christ also says, you know, my yoke is light.
Right, but the lightness would be an emergent consequence of the degree of voluntary acceptance.
Yeah.
Right.
Be like a hint of resurrection, a hint of that which comes back in the capacity to give yourself towards something which is meaningful. Right?
Yeah,
And
well,
so
that paradox of heaviness and lightness is very strange, because you might say the cross is heavy until it's optimally shouldered. It's something like that. And that does work psychologically, because what you do see happening with people as they transform spiritually, because that's the right way of thinking about it, is that they become able to bear the burdens with more and more grace. And so the burdens are lighter because they're more competent. There's obviously a relationship between how heavy the burden is and how strong you are. And then the secret is that the pathway to strength is through the voluntary shouldering of the burden. And then you have to ask yourself, well, could it be any different if the confrontation with mortal limitation and the atrocity of hell, in some sense, is the core problem of life? And I can't see how it can be otherwise. And then how could it be that you could possibly adapt to that without facing it and allowing that reality to become the ultimate reality, and allowing your knowledge of that reality to transform you into what you would need to be in order to do that? Like, the alternative would be to avoid, to not do that. Well, then what? Well, then you stay immature, you stay trapped in a narrow hedonism, you stay irresponsible, you stay out of communion with others. Well, and you think that's not going to lead to more suffering?
Yeah.
So there's this, I was thinking about that today when we were walking down the Via Dolorosa. I thought, well, why hasn't the fact that this is voluntary exposure been mapped already by the clinical psychologists? Because it's just obvious that that's the case. Once you see it, it's like, well, yeah, obviously. And maybe it's just because it takes a long time for the explicit and the implicit to map each other, right?
Yeah.
It's not, once you see it, it's there, but it's not so simple to see it to begin with.
And so we're in a moment right now, at least I sense that we're in a moment where, not to be dramatic, but it feels as if Western civilization, the last 2,000 years maybe, maybe more, maybe even more, maybe even before that, it feels like things are teetering.
Yeah.
That we're coming to something that can be a massive crash, that could be worse than what happened.
I think it's a Moore's law issue. Computational power is doubling, right? But we're in this time now where the doublings are occurring so quickly that they're occurring not only within the span of a human life, but within the span of a fragment of a human life. So computation power doubles every 18 months. Storage power doubles every year. But that's not the only doubling. Scientific knowledge doubles every, I don't know what it is, 4 years or something like that. Wealth doubles every 14 years. Like, we're in this period of the conjunction of many, many extremely rapid doubling. So it's a very rapid time of transformation. And there's always that tilt towards heaven and hell that's part of the movement forward. It's just happening at a very, very accelerated rate at the moment. So we can see it, we can see the possibilities more starkly. Like, it's very strange to me that someone like Marian Tupy, who's a very good economist, can write a book called Superabundance, laying out the fact that we're in better material shape than we have ever been by a huge margin, and that's increasing so fast it's almost unbelievable. At the same time, we're simultaneously flirting with the Third World War.
Yeah.
But I think it is a consequence of the acceleration of a fractal phenomena that's been playing itself out since the beginning of time. And I've been thinking about that more and more as something like the conflict between the spirit of Cain and the spirit of Abel. I mean,
so what do you think? Because we're seeing it happen. We're watching it happen, and there's a sense in which it feels like a truck that's out of control.
Yeah.
It feels like a boat that's adrift, and the waves are getting bigger. And so, I think many people feel. Or
there's a bunch of demons on the ship that are trying to drive it adrift onto the rocks.
I think many people feel that. So implicitly or explicitly, people have a sense in which there's this point, and sometimes I feel like maybe there are some who desire it.
Yeah.
Right. That there is actually a desire to come to this crash.
Well, there's definitely a spirit that desires it.
Yeah.
That's Thanatos, the death wish, the Freudian death wish. Well, that's partly Mephistophelian. I mean, Goethe's Mephistopheles, his credo was, there's so much suffering that it would be better if everything was just eradicated. You could extend it, there is so much suffering and sin that it would be better if everything was just eradicated. And that's definitely, that's part of the Luciferian intellect.
And that story seems to be, if that story was told in a mythological way in Goethe, it seems to be coming, there are people who are saying that out loud.
Yeah.
That they're saying
and that it should happen.
That it should happen. But then even in this weird moment with the war in Russia and Ukraine, there's like people seem to be playing with the idea that we're basically running towards a nuclear catastrophe. And like, where's everybody, it's as if it's not a big deal. It's like we're watching Netflix and it's the end of a movie.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's also a consequence of too much virtualization.
Yeah.
Right? Because things have become so virtual that when we see a drama like that play out in the world, it's hard to discriminate it from mere entertainment. Because it really is amazing how little fear there is. You said to me yesterday, I thought something that was so perspicacious, which was that, well, we're in 1982 again, or 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, except no one's afraid.
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell? Because I think the situation we're in right now is arguably as serious as the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis,
sure.
or 1982 when when of course Hollywood was producing The Day After, and there were science fiction novels about the global or the nuclear winter, and everyone knew it would be a catastrophe.
Yeah, in school they would make us duck and cover.
Yeah,
Go into
and
the
now
desk
then no children are wearing masks, but they're not preparing for nuclear war. It's very, very weird.
Yeah. And so I think, I mean, what I'm getting to, I don't know what I'm getting to, but what I see it around me, I see, and it's actually not a political issue, and that's what's interesting, is that as much the people that are on the environmental side and feel like things are breaking apart in terms of, the world is going to end because global warming.
Yeah.
The world is going to end because nuclear war. The world is going to end because all our values are falling apart, and so the social fabric is being completely frayed. And so I guess the question is, I
think the world's coming to an end because we're not sacrificing ourselves properly.
Yeah.
No, I thought when I started working on what I've been working on in 1985 or thereabouts, mostly from reading Jung and Solzhenitsyn and Viktor Frankl, I would say to some degree, it appeared to me that the proper way forward, the proper ex hodos, was the re-instantiation of a deep ethic at an individual level, that it would have to be a consequence of the redemption of the individual soul, and that the reason that we're in the situation we're in right now, most fundamentally, is because it's because of sin.
Yeah,
There's no other way of thinking about it. And the reason that I've been talking to individuals about getting their house in order is because I don't think that there is a way forward apart from that. Is that it's collective in a sense that everybody has to adopt every single individual has to adopt their collective responsibility. That's the collective element of it. But it's still a matter of the individual soul, like it always has been. And a matter of that soul being willing to engage in the proper sacrificial process to set the world right. And that's on everybody.
Yeah. And so do you think it's possible to do that without the story, like without participating?
No, I don't. I don't think so. It's definitely not possible to do it without the story. And then the question is, and something you've made me more aware of, I would say, is, well, to what degree does the story not only have to be told and understood, because I'm very big on understanding the story. It's, well, yeah, but it has to be acted out, right? Because I believe belief is expressed in action, most fundamentally. It has to be acted out. And your insistence is that, well, it also has to be ritualized and dramatized and embodied and collectively worshipped in this ritualized form that's characteristic of, let's say, church worship. And, I'm very open to that as a necessity. It's partly how the story's transmitted, but more importantly, how the story's translated into actual action. So, I don't see that it's possible without the story.
And for people who are wondering, there are smaller versions of that you can see it playing out now, right? You know that Justin Trudeau banned the Canadian flag from Canada Day in Ottawa this year.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. People were not allowed to bring Canadian flags into the celebration. I mean, it was because of the trucker protest that the Canadian flag, I guess, had become associated. But this is where you can see how the problem of not participating in the story is at the highest level, right, at the transcendent level, is going to trickle down. And you're going to find that it will become shameful to participate at every level. Even like your family, it's almost like you celebrate Thanksgiving, you celebrate Christmas, the cynicism about Christmas or the different holidays. All of this are just images of the same, where it's like celebration of the things that bind us are being demonized.
The corrosive claim is that the sole thing that binds us is the drive to power. And to me, I say this with such hesitance, it's a satanic claim. And the reason it's a satanic claim is because it's a claim that the spirit that's embodied in the dramatic representation of Satan is the expression of arbitrary power and force. And so to say that which binds us, regardless of your protestations, you and your emphasis on free speech and civilized dialogue, that's nothing but a mask for the true underlying reality which is nothing but the manifestation of the drive to power. And so if you accept that, then of course any celebration like Christmas becomes abhorrent because it's the ultimate in hypocrisy.
Yeah.
It's the masking of power in moral virtue. And so it has to become the worst thing, unless the claim that power is the fundamental motivator is wrong, and it is wrong.
Yeah.
Because that desire for arbitrary power, that's something like using the Lord's name in vain. That's taking to yourself that which should be associated with the transcendent. That's corruption, not what unifies. And what's the doctrine? That the thing about you that's most corrupt is what unifies us all? That's your claim? Because your claim is that power in some sense is corrupt. The use of power is corrupt.
Yeah.
And you're saying that characterizes everything. So that's your claim, is it? That the entire motive structure of civilization and all social order is nothing but that which is most corrupt.
And
that's a hell of a claim.
It has reflections in the most surprising ways, which is that as we move away from celebrating the things that bind us, whether it be our religious participation, whether it be our common histories, our common, our heritages that we celebrate, the great people of our past.
The willingness to engage in civil dialogue.
And there's still worshiping, and there's still celebration. And the question is, what is it that we celebrate? And what's come about now, and this is what we're seeing, the new religion, the religion seeping in, is something like we worship difference. We worship multiplicity. We worship idiosyncrasy. We worship the things that make us different. And it's like, it's when you see it that way, you realize just how insane it is. It's like we're worshiping.
Well, I know, we're trying to put multiplicity at the center.
At the top. We're trying to take trying to take things that divide us, and now we're trying to make that into the thing we celebrate. And we think that we're going to
jointly, communally.
We think we're going to be able to bind together.
As
anything. If we do that, it's a wild situation.
Well, then we say, and we can say what we saw today, which is the proper spirit that unites us psychologically and socially is the voluntary willingness to undertake the burden of death and hell onto yourself. And that seems exactly right. And all alternatives to that seem lesser. And you can think, if you think rationally, having that axiom put in place, if you think rationally, well, how could it be any different? Because that is what you have to do if you want to confront life forthrightly in full force. And so it has to be that spirit that unites us, because what else could? The willingness to live in the face of mortal tragedy and catastrophe and malevolence, all of that.
Yeah, and when you look at what happened, let's say, what brought about the founding of Jerusalem, it's almost, when you realize that the Roman Empire, right, the most powerful empire in the world, with all its kind of fragility at the moment that it was, nonetheless was willing to put at its center, right, a story which was the opposite in some ways of what it had represented until then. Right? It's just the strangest thing. Whereas as if now the binding of the empire.
I guess it's partly, you could think about it from the perspective of the compensatory theme, in some sense, that Jung developed. So Jung's notion, and the psychoanalysts in general developed this notion, Freud, Adler, and Jung, was that if you veered too far in one direction, then a compensatory fantasy would start to aggregate on the opposite pole. And you could think about veering too far in one direction would be something like top-down left hemisphere semantic dominance. This is the way it is. Okay, but it's missing something vital. Okay, so what's vital? Well, the right hemisphere, in some sense, aggregates the anomalies that are associated with what's missing and starts to develop a counter theory. And then a story comes along that unites all the counter theories, and it just goes bang.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what you're missing.
That is definitely the way. Because people always forget.
The ground is prepared by the radical. See, this is why my lectures on responsibility are hitting home.
But so don't you see that? So this is, I don't know if you're willing to go this far, but can't you see to some extent that, that image from Goya, right? The sleep of reason produces monsters. You've probably seen this engraving. It's like, that's the surprise of the Enlightenment. It's that the Enlightenment the Enlightenment as it was being proposed as this hyper-rationalistic system that was going to solve all the problems had an underside which was already bubbling, even in its outset. It appears right away, by the way.
Well, it appears in the French Revolution.
It appears in Marquis de Sade.
Right.
You have the Enlightenment, and then you have Sade and Sacer-Masoch. Like the sadomasochism appears right at the outset of the Enlightenment. Yeah. You could say that they're almost Enlightenment figures.
Yeah, well, okay, so how are you going to make sex rational? Yeah, good luck with that.
And so you can see this dark thing preparing itself or bubbling as the Enlightenment develops. It appears as some darker aspects of Romanticism. It appears as 19th century decadence, these decadent symbolic movements that appeared in the end of the 19th century. So this dark undercurrent is there, always willing to come up.
Yeah, well, that's partly, Freud commented on that too, because Freud's big elements of contention, let's say, were sexuality and rage. Well, he added the death instinct to that. And so those were the irrational elements of the id. They weren't easily incorporable into... The man engaged in passionate intercourse with his wife is not a scientist. Right.
That's right.
Really.
That's right. No,
really.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So that doesn't fit.
But to me, it's that.
So if the animality doesn't fit, let's say, then it becomes monstrous.
Yeah. But to me, it's really important, this question, because in some ways, we're at this moment, and I think it's kind of all around us, where some people are reacting to the situation. And they're saying, we need to go back to the Enlightenment. We need to go back. I think I don't think that's possible. Because I think that where we are is a product of the Enlightenment.
Well, the Enlightenment wasn't predicated on the idea that we see the world through a story. The Enlightenment was predicated on the idea that we can see the world through a scientific framework.
That's right.
And you can see the world partially sometimes through a scientific framework for particular reasons.
That's right.
And that's a way different claim. And Jung knew, like the postmodernists, that the scientific endeavor was necessarily embedded in a narrative. And I think the scientists have figured that out now too.
Yeah.
So looks like it.
And so I guess in some ways the question is then how do we reintegrate this?
By having these conversations and by taping them with the Daily Wire.
That's right.
Here in Bethlehem.
Here in Bethlehem.
Yeah, well, the rough beast slouches towards Jerusalem. Yeah, well, cheers, sir.
Cheers, Jordan.
Yep.
Thanks.
You bet, man. Rome, the final stop of our journey. Why are we here?
After the death of Julius Caesar, Christianity emerges. People did sense this is a really different message.
Here we are looking at the spectacular ruins of this spectacular building. It's so viscerally impressive.
To stand in this city and realize 2,000 years later, by God, Christianity, it won.
Join Bishop Robert Barron and me as we discuss the way the Romans spread Christian morality